It was the announcement now heard around the world.
I got a call late last night. My wife has passed away. And yeah, it was self-induced, and it was up in North Carolina.
A South Carolina pastor casually getting up at the end of service and announcing to his congregation that his wife had died.
I just want my family to know where to find me.
He says suicide, but friends, family, and even his wife says it was something different.
A lot of people want to know if you murdered your wife.
But does abuse hurt people? How do you think God feels about that?
Do you want to go to jail?
They'll be on Facebook in a few hours.
This is one of the most bizarre stories you'll ever hear.
And he was texting me at this point saying, I'll be at your house at 12:55. I'm armed and ready.
Listen, if you ever want to know what I'm going through in life, it's always about what I'm preaching about.
The way that he treated her, and honestly, in some ways, he kind of treated a lot of women that way.
So what really happened to Mica? Was she pushed to the brink to pull the trigger herself? Or was she someone simply struggling with mental health?
What do we want? Just Mica!
She was probably the greatest wife anyone could ask for.
This guy came into the restaurant where I've been working and left his phone number on his receipt.
He abused her in every possible way that there is.
This is a story of John Paul and Mica Miller. Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, April 28th, 2024.
Instead, I'm going to have you stand up, and I'm going to make an announcement. And after the announcement, I'm going to ask that you leave church quietly and don't talk about the announcement. I got a call late last night. My wife has passed away. And yeah, it was self-induced, and it was up in North Carolina.
That's Pastor John Paul Miller of Solid Rock Church at Market Commons, casually announcing the suicide of his wife just hours before.
Y'all pray for me and my kids and everybody. And y'all knew that she wasn't well mentally, and that she needed her medicine that was hard to get to her.
Mica Miller, a 30-year-old young woman who, according to friends and family, was looking forward to her future. But it's this video, this announcement alone, that captures the attention of the entire world. Certainly an odd way to announce, especially for a pastor, that his wife, hours before, had taken her own life. And because of this video, it presents more questions than answers. But before we move forward, let's take a step back and look at the events that led to this moment.
You can kiss your bride!
Back in 2012, Mica marries her first husband, Jeremy, at the age of 18. And as their pastor, John Paul Miller, was happy to conduct their wedding. And according to sources, Jeremy and John Paul were best friends.
Oh, look! Oh, you make me cry and I gotta go to work.
But just a few years later, in 2015, Mica and John Paul Miller were allegedly caught in a sexual act with each other. And that's when their affair was made public. The spouses of Mica and John Paul Miller immediately filed for divorce. And John Paul Miller asked for forgiveness from his congregation. And he had the support of the elders. And according to multiple people who were members of the church at that time, the elders told them that they're not good Christians if they don't forgive their pastor. After taking a few weeks off, John Paul Miller returns to the pulpit, and his relationship with Mica continues. A couple of years later, John Paul Miller and Mica tie the knot in 2017. But we've all heard the saying, once a cheater, always a cheater. According to multiple sources, Mica wasn't the only woman in her husband's life. Meet Susie Skinner. Susie and her husband, Chris, are members at Solid Rock Church at Market Commons. And according to sources, Susie and John Paul Miller begin an affair in 2021. Also in the same year, tragedy strikes the Skinner household.
We're learning more about the man who died after being found unresponsive in an Horry County pool. The victim was 40-year-old Christopher Skinner, a paraplegic and a motivational speaker.
Susie Skinner's husband, Chris Skinner, is found dead in a community pool on Labor Day 2021. Now, Chris was bound to a wheelchair due to an accident that had happened some 20 years prior. He was familiar with this pool, and according to Susie, he enjoyed going out there by himself. But on this day, according to reports, Chris misjudged how close he was to the pool and drowned.
It's very, very exciting. I was Chris's pastor to preach a funeral in which I don't have to lie. It's probably my first funeral where I get to say all the truthful stuff, and that's because we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that Chris was a child of God, is a child of God, faithful husband, wonderful father, great friend, brother, son.
Now, despite rumors of the alleged affair between Susie and John Paul Miller, I can't confirm when their relationship began. Therefore, I don't know if it was before or after Chris's death.
Be loyal. You know, loyalty is not a word that we hear in our vernacular very, very often anymore.
It's also unknown whether Mica Miller knew of the affair. But in October of 2023, she's had enough. And she files for divorce from her husband. That divorce, for reasons unknown, was dismissed in February of 2024. At this point, Mica and John Paul are struggling in their relationship, and they had been for quite some time. Matter of fact, Mica moves to Kansas to give a trial separation, and John Paul is very open about their struggles, even his wife's mental health. Eventually, Mica comes back to try again, but things just don't work out, and they separate sometime in 2024. And now, with them separated, this is where the story gets interesting. On February 8th, 2024, Mica is admitted into a mental facility. According to reports, Mica says that she was forced to go. And the family of Mica Miller says that John Paul used this opportunity to gain access to Mica Miller's electronic devices. You see, Mica was gathering evidence, getting ready for her divorce with John Paul. But according to the family, John Paul deleted all of that evidence. And also, according to the family, John Paul took Mica's stuff from their residence and moved it to a friend's apartment. But John Paul has a very different story as to what happened.
Last year, my wife, they went to Africa, had a wonderful trip, amazing trip, and she came back with the idea to start a school in Africa. And 6 weeks ago, she goes in the hospital, gets out, and just leaves. Just completely leaves me, leaves everything, drains the bank account, and goes. And guess what? While you're talking bad about me out there, I'm building a school in Africa for over 100 kids to be able to be fed.
Days later, on February 10th, Mica is out of the hospital. But now she files a police report saying that John Paul Miller took her car while she was admitted. Police do nothing because they say it's simply a marital asset, and he has every right to the vehicle as she does. Weeks later, despite John Paul Miller being the primary financial provider of Mica and his relationship, he files for spousal support. That request is eventually dismissed, but what's interesting on this very day, the same day, February 23rd, John Paul Miller leaves his phone number on a receipt for a waitress.
So there's something that's been on my mind and on my heart for a few days, but really it goes back a few months to February when this guy came into the restaurant where I've been working and left his phone number on his receipt. To make a long story short, I looked him up and he was the senior pastor of a local church, and I thought, let's see what he's about.
A conversation proceeds to happen, an explicit one at that. where John Paul Miller is seen begging for photos from this woman. Now keep in mind, John Paul Miller is still legally married, and according to sources, allegedly still dating Susie Skinner. A few days later, on February 25th, listen to what Pastor John Paul Miller says in his sermon about those who are mentally sick.
When you're mentally ill, it's the one sickness you have that you don't know you're sick. And you have to trust people around you because you're saying, no, they're lying to me. They're telling me I need medicine. I don't need medicine, because the thing that's sick is your mind, and your mind is what you need to realize that you're sick.
Then, a few weeks later on March 10th, John Paul Miller, in another sermon, reveals that he goes through his wife's electronic device and 2 years' worth of messages. He says that he finds 18 people reaching out to her, saying if she wants to talk, they'll be happy to talk to her. This visibly upsets John Paul Miller.
When my wife went in the hospital, I looked at her phone and I counted over the past 2 years, 18 people who had texted her and said, if you ever want to talk about your husband, you can talk to me and say anything and I'll keep it confidential. Why the heck does somebody want to hear what somebody else says about their spouse? But if you're going to talk about somebody else, that's a demon actually right there.
And that's not the only strange thing he says in this sermon.
Listen, if you ever want to know what I'm going through in life, it's always about what I'm preaching about. God is so good to do that every single time. One day I'm going to preach about getting rich, strong, healthy, and finding a hot wife that loves Jesus. That's what I'm going to do. I'm just kidding. That was wrong. I told you I shouldn't be here today. I told you.
The very next day, Mica Miller files a police report saying her tire was slashed.
Walk away.
I'll show you the pictures.
Do you want to go to jail?
They'll be on Facebook in a few hours.
Alrighty, you'll be in jail in a few hours.
This was simply speculation early on in the story as to who slashed her tire. But News Nation obtains an email where John Paul Miller allegedly confesses to the crime.
One of the things that is included in these documents is an apology email from him to Mica on April 15th of this year, which is about 12 days before she died. In it, he writes, "I'm sorry for damaging your car, tires, etc. If you ever come back, I will turn in both cars and get you a nice SUV or whatever car you want. Again, my horrible flesh pattern of hurting someone when they hurt me."
The following Sunday on March 17th, Pastor John Paul Miller tells a story of another pastor. And it's an interesting story. He says the wife of that pastor left him for a man on his staff. But listen carefully to the details.
A friend of mine that's a pastor called me last week, and one day on a Monday, his wife told him that he was the greatest husband in the world, that she loved her life and she was so appreciative. The very next day something happened and she left. And he didn't know where she went. She just left. Left all of her things, left everything she had, everything she worked for, everything. He didn't know what to think. He had no idea what was going on. So he hired a third-party service to find her and see where she was living and that kind of stuff. And they did. And last week they turned in all of their evidence to his lawyer, and he discovered that she had left him for one of his staff members, a young man that he had trained to learn how to preach, that he had shared his pulpit with him. A young man who the pastor had paid to go to Bible college, gave him a job. He worked hand in hand with the pastor. And in one fleeting moment, the pastor lost his wife and his good friend all at the same time. When he saw the information over at the lawyers, he started to throw up. Just throw up one trash can, second trash can, a third trash can, and he just started to dry heave. He couldn't believe what he saw was the most horrible image and worst thing you could ever imagine. The lawyer drew up the divorce papers. The lawyer told him and said, you have everything you need now. You can be divorced in 3 months. And you'll never have to see her again. You won't have to give her a dime. There's far more than enough information to take care of everything. The pastor said, give me the papers, draw them up. They got all the paperwork ready. They put the pen in his hand, and he just couldn't sign the paper. They said, but don't you see everything, and don't you understand? And he called a lot of the elders, and they supported If he wanted to leave her, just leave her. This is it. And for some reason, he just couldn't do it. And so he went home and he wrote her a letter. And all he said was, I forgive you for what you've done. And I already forgive you for whatever you're going to do. Whenever you want to be restored, just call. And if you want a divorce, you'll have to leave me, because the Bible says, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. He left. And the hardest thing he's ever had to go through, he can't hear from God very clearly. He doesn't know what God wants him to do. He knows that she's not herself and doesn't know how to handle it or how to respond. The rage, the rejection, the relationship, it's all there. And so if you get a chance, pray that his heart does not remain angry or upset, because it's destroying him.
Interesting. Remember the News Nation reporter?
Earlier this week, I believe it was Monday, I engaged with him and he started talking back with me, kind of unprovoked. And I also want to read this because this thing stood out to me when I read it at the time. I didn't really know it. He said, this is JP to me, I even hired a PI to put trackers on her car to know if she was going to a gun store, because she kept trying to get a gun for the past few months. I have never once in my entire life ever hurt her in any way, ever.
Once again, John Paul Miller confessing to putting tracking devices on his wife's car. After that sermon, Mica's sister, Sierra Francis, takes to Facebook. She says she keeps an eye on her phone for fear of her sister's safety. And then, the very next day, Mica Miller speaks.
Hey everybody, I just want to let you know that I'm alive and well, and life's been kind of crazy the couple past weeks, months, years, but I've kind of had to keep my circle really small for the past couple weeks, just because I'm going through a lot and it's hard, and it's my cross to bear. It's the thing that God has put in my life to deal with, and I don't want to bring a lot of people into it. When your world is shook up, you need to take a pause. And I can only pray that more people will take a pause and I'm trying to get my priorities straight right now. And that's making sure that my heart doesn't have any unforgiveness, bitterness, resentment, just forgiveness and hope for the future and peace. Because you can't put a price on peace.
A few days later, she posts a second video, this time suggesting she's being abused, physically and mentally.
So you don't have to stay in a abusive relationship, whether that's sexual, whether that's somebody forcing you to take illegal drugs, or alcohol abuse, or physical abuse, psychological abuse, making you think that this is all your fault, or you're a bad mom, or you're a bad wife, or you're a bad husband, or you're not giving it your all when you know you are. God hates divorce, but why? According to everybody I've asked and the scriptures that I've found, it's because it hurts people. But does abuse hurt people? How do you think God feels about that?
Serious accusations coming from the wife of a pastor. And that doesn't make John Paul Miller very happy. So, he files a police report saying he's being harassed by his wife on social media, telling police, quote, "I'm worried about my reputation." A few weeks go by, and then on April 16th, Mica Miller files for spousal support herself. A few days later, a notice is sent out for a court hearing, and it is assumed that's when Pastor John Paul Miller is served with the documents. But Mica Miller would never make it to that court date.
Robertson County 911, what's the address of your emergency?
Saturday, April 27th.
Hi, are you able to trace the location of my phone?
At the Lumber River State Park?
Yeah, that's where I am.
Mica Miller loses her life.
Tell me what's happened.
I'm about to myself, and I just want my family to know where to find me.
The very next day, at the end of his second service, Pastor John Paul Miller makes the announcement that captures the attention of millions.
I got a call late last night. My wife has passed away. Yeah, it was self-induced, and it was up in North Carolina.
Later that day, Mica's sister, Sierra Francis, goes to Facebook once again, saying to not believe the lies being told about her sister. And according to Mica's family, John Paul Miller sent this text message to the family just hours after Mica's death, saying, "This is what happens when you encourage someone to divorce the person they love and tell them they don't need medicine." A few days later, on April 30th, John Paul Miller attempts to get into Mica's apartment, but he's stopped by the building manager, and that person calls police immediately. Police show up, but it's unknown whether John Paul left with anything. Later that day, according to the family, they ask authorities whether toxicology test was done, whether an autopsy was done, whether gunshot residue tests were done on Mica's body. They are told no. Mica's body is then released to John Paul Miller. And at first, John Paul refuses to let the family see her body. He eventually agrees as long as they sign the certificate for cremation. On May 2nd, John Paul Miller does an interview with ABC 15, saying that Mica was probably the greatest wife anyone could ever have.
She was probably the greatest wife anyone could ask for. She was incredibly affirming. We spent every night together for hours just talking and talking and talking.
He also reminds people of her mental health illness. But I want you to take a look at something that online detectives found. A necklace around the neck of John Paul Miller. Odd, because it looks just like Mica's necklace. And that's not the only interview John Paul does that day. In a story from the Christian Post, John Paul Miller says his wife was diagnosed with bipolar II, schizophrenia, and all kinds of mental health issues. He claims to have begged friends and family to help him, but nobody took his word. Within hours of those interviews, affidavits from the siblings of Mica Miller are filed. According to reports, Mica Miller feared her husband, and Mica's sister says that on one weekend while visiting, trying to get away from the situation, John Paul Miller was not happy that Mica was gone. He texts Mica's sister, saying that he's coming to get her, and he is armed and ready.
I need to report a non-emergency at this point.
Okay, what's going on?
My sister came here today to visit because her and her husband were having issues. She came from Myrtle. She told him she'll be home on Tuesday. And he is texting me at this point saying, "I'll be at your house at 12:55. I'm armed and ready, and I will keep you up all night. I'm going to get her back."
And according to the same affidavits filed by Mica's siblings, Mica once told her sister that if a bullet ends up in my head, it wasn't me. It was John Paul.
What do we want? Justice for Mica. When do we want it? Now. What do we want? Justice for Mica.
On May 5th, Solid Rock Church announces that they have temporarily dismissed John Paul Miller as protests erupt outside of their Sunday service. John Paul Miller holds a funeral for his wife later that afternoon without the support of her family. In the service, he says a few things that seem a little odd.
But I got this lay next to her body and spent time with her body about 4 times this week, and each time it still didn't hit me. I thought she was going to wake up, you know. I even tried to raise her from the dead one time this week. And
after the service, according to one man, he says John Paul Miller attended a bar, showing no remorse for the death of his wife. The very next day, on May 6, the news that everyone had been waiting for. The North Carolina medical examiner officially rules Mica Miller's death a suicide. On May 7th, Robertson County Sheriff's Department also released their findings. They say Mica drove over an hour away to a North Carolina state park, and that's where she took her life. According to them and the evidence that they have presented, there is no doubt that Mica Miller did this herself. And they also say that John Paul Miller was nowhere near the scene. According to police, he was with another woman who he's allegedly in a romantic relationship with. Many believe this woman is Susie Skinner. Now with the cause of death official, John Paul Miller has heard enough, and he hires an attorney. Russell B. Long releases a statement denying all accusations of his client. He also reminds everybody of Mica's mental illness, and to add to it, they threaten lawsuit to anyone who says John Paul Miller abused his wife. According to his attorney, John Paul is trying to live in peace and mourn the death of Mica. Despite the threat of a lawsuit, Mica Miller's family doubles down. Later that night, the attorney for the family, Regina Ward, speaks up.
That she was brainwashed by this man. He abused her in every possible way that there is. Financially, he abused her by taking away things, phones, access to money, took away her car, those types of things to try to gain control of her. Every time she tried to leave him, he would harass and stalk her to the point that she just felt like she had to give up and go back. And he abused her not only emotionally, financially, he abused her religiously in terms of her religion and her relationship with God.
And the family isn't the only one doubling down. The next day, in a bombshell report from the Daily Mail, they accused John Paul Miller of being addicted to prostitutes and having sex with children under the age of 16. The Daily Mail obtains documents from John Paul Miller's divorce in 2017. According to affidavits, John Paul's ex-wife, Allison, says he's addicted to prostitutes and confessed to her that he had had inappropriate relationships with children under the age of 16. And the accusations don't end there.
I absolutely do not believe that she took her own life because she was energetic and her faith in God was unwavering.
In a video released by a man named Ty Longerbeam, John Paul Miller is seen laying in the front yard of allegedly his ex-wife's house. He's having some sort of mental episode, and according to the man who posted this video, this was around the time he was exposed for having an affair with Mica Miller.
Is your medication something they gave you? Yeah. You want me to make sure Mark's coming? But somebody's called him, right?
Yeah, the lady across the street called.
Okay. All right.
And the downfall continues. In a shocking turn of events, John Paul Miller appears to confess to some of his crimes.
Is that he apologized for something else. And this was something we were unsure of. There were allegations that Mica had been threatened, that a topless photo of her would be posted on the internet. And now he is admitting that it was him. He was the one making those threats.
Yes, so this goes back to this apology letter that we have. It's an apology letter from him to Mica, dated April 15th. In it, he's apologizing for a series of things, and one of them is a photo that was produced on the internet. It was topless of her. We're not going to show that here, of course, but in the apology, he says, "I'm sorry for putting a picture of you on the internet. It was for less than 1 hour and immediately taken down. I was hurt that you were telling everyone horrible, intimate details of my past sin, and I just wanted to try and hurt you. Please forgive me. It was evil of me to do that."
That's right. John Paul Miller admits to posting a topless photo of his wife on social media days before her death. With evidence of tracking devices, slashed tires, and topless photos, was Mica Miller pushed to suicide after enduring years of alleged abuse? It seems authorities have seen enough.
This morning, an unexpected twist in the death of a South Carolina pastor's wife. The sheriff announcing the FBI and U.S. attorney are helping in the Mica Miller investigation.
One announcement that changed everything for John Paul Miller. And it seems after all of that, there may be even more to this story. Was it mental health? Or was her husband, John Paul Miller, responsible for the death of his wife, Mica Miller?
So, I want to remind you, like a bunch of people have been reminding me lately, that I'm God's bride first. And even an earthly spouse, who's a good spouse, when they know that their bride is being hurt, just imagine what an earthly spouse does. What do you think your heavenly spouse does when you're the bride of Christ and he sees his bride going through abuse and hurt? What do you think he thinks about that?